Sarah Martinez pulled her long sleeves down for the 100th time that morning, making sure every inch of scarred skin remained hidden beneath the soft cotton fabric. The coffee shop buzzed with the usual Tuesday morning crowd, business people checking emails, students hunched over textbooks, and retirees enjoying leisurely conversations over steaming mugs. She had chosen this particular corner table for a reason. It sat tucked away from the main traffic flow, offering her a clear view of the entrance while keeping her back to the wall. After 3 years of carefully planned public outings, Sarah had mastered the art of strategic positioning. The barista, a cheerful young woman named Emma, approached with Sarah's regular order, a large vanilla latte with an extra shot of espresso. Sarah had been coming here every Tuesday for months, always ordering the same thing, always sitting in the same spot. Emma knew better than to comment on the long sleeves Sarah wore, regardless of weather, or the way she sometimes winced when reaching for her cup. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Emma said, setting the drink down gently. "The sun's finally breaking through those clouds." Sarah managed a small smile. "Yes, it's lovely. Thank you." As Emma walked away, Sarah wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug, savoring the comfort it provided. The familiar ritual of her morning coffee had become one of the few constants in her dramatically altered life. Before the accident, she had been a different person entirely, confident, outgoing, quick to laugh, and even quicker to strike up conversations with strangers. The fire had changed everything. 2 years, 4 months. And 16 days ago, Sarah's apartment building had caught fire due to faulty electrical wiring. She had been trapped on the 3rd floor when the hallway filled with smoke and flames. The burns covered 30% of her body, primarily her arms, shoulders, and part of her neck. The physical healing had taken months, but the emotional scars ran deeper than any surgeon could reach. She took a cautious sip of her latte, glancing around the coffee shop. Most people paid her no attention, lost in their own morning routines and personal dramas. This anonymity had become both a blessing and a curse. Part of her longed for the easy social connections she once enjoyed, while another part felt relief at being overlooked. The bell above the entrance chimed, and a group of college students entered, their voices carrying across the small space. Sarah recognized them from previous visits. They usually commandeered the large table near the window, spreading out textbooks and laptops while engaging in animated discussions about everything from upcoming exams to weekend plans. Today, however, their energy seemed different. There was an edge to their laughter, a sharpness that made Sarah unconsciously pull her sleeves down again. She tried to focus on her drink and the book she had brought, but their voices grew louder as they settled into their usual spot. "Did you see that girl who works at the campus bookstore?" one of them was saying. "The one with all those weird marks on her arms?" Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who they were talking about, another young woman who had clearly endured some kind of trauma that left visible reminders. Sarah had seen her once, briefly, and felt an instant kinship with someone who understood the daily struggle of existing in a world that often equated physical perfection with worth. "Oh my God, yes," another voice chimed in. "It's so gross. I don't understand why she doesn't just cover them up or something." "Maybe she likes the attention," a third voice suggested, followed by cruel laughter. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly around her mug. The casual cruelty in their voices transported her back to countless moments over the past 2 years when she had endured similar comments. People seemed to forget that those with visible differences were still human beings with feelings, hearts that could break just as easily as anyone else's. She considered leaving, gathering her book and retreating to the safety of her apartment, but something kept her rooted to her chair. Perhaps it was the memory of all the times she had wished someone, anyone, would speak up when she faced similar ridicule. Or maybe it was the growing realization that silence in the face of cruelty was its own form of complicity. The conversation at the table continued, growing more vicious with each passing moment. They speculated about what might have caused the bookstore employee's scars, each suggestion more insensitive than the last. They mimicked what they imagined her voice might sound like, created fictional backstories designed to mock rather than empathize. Sarah found herself studying the other patrons in the coffee shop. Surely someone else was hearing this. Surely someone else would recognize how wrong this was. But everyone seemed absorbed in their own activities, either genuinely unaware of the cruel commentary or choosing to ignore it. The students' laughter grew louder, more confident. They fed off each other's energy, each trying to top the previous comment with something even more cutting. Sarah realized this wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was practiced, refined through repetition. These young people had likely engaged in this type of behavior before, targeting anyone they deemed different or vulnerable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister. "Hope you're having a good morning out. Proud of you for getting out there." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, finally venturing into public spaces again after months of self-imposed isolation, only to witness the exact type of behavior that had driven her into hiding in the first place. Her sister had encouraged her to rebuild her social connections, to not let other people's ignorance control her life. But moments like this made retreat seem like the only rational choice. Sarah glanced toward the counter where Emma was preparing drinks for the morning rush. The barista's expression suggested she could hear the students' conversation, but she remained focused on her work, probably unwilling to confront customers who might complain to management. The bell chimed again, and Sarah looked up to see an older man entering the coffee shop. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had endured significant hardship, his left leg clearly artificial beneath his worn jeans. Despite his physical limitations, he carried himself with quiet dignity, his silver hair neatly combed and his flannel shirt pressed and clean. He approached the counter and ordered a simple black coffee, his voice polite but reserved. Sarah noticed the way he scanned the room, taking in the various conversations and activities with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. His gaze lingered briefly on the group of students, his expression growing thoughtful. As he waited for his order, the cruel commentary continued behind him. The students had moved on from discussing the bookstore employee to sharing other stories of people they had encountered and found amusing or disgusting. Each tale was worse than the last, revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond casual insensitivity. Sarah watched the older man's shoulders tense slightly as he listened. His hands, weathered and scarred from what she guessed was a lifetime of hard work and possibly military service, gripped the counter edge. She could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the desire to speak versus the wisdom of staying uninvolved. The barista handed him his coffee with a sympathetic look that suggested she, too, was uncomfortable with the ongoing conversation. The man nodded his thanks, turned slowly, and surveyed the available seating options. Most tables were occupied, leaving him with limited choices. Sarah realized she was holding her breath, watching this stranger navigate a situation that felt all too familiar. Would he find a seat and ignore the cruelty happening just a few feet away? Would he leave entirely, choosing not to subject himself to their toxic energy? Or would he do something that most people seemed incapable of, actually take a stand? The students' laughter reached a crescendo as one of them finished another particularly vicious story. In that moment, Sarah saw the older man's expression change. Something shifted in his posture, a straightening that spoke of decisions made and lines drawn. He took a slow sip of his coffee, set his jaw, and began moving toward their table. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what was about to happen. After months of witnessing cruelty met with silence, she was about to see someone actually do something about it. The older man approached the students' table with measured steps, his coffee cup steady in his scarred hands. The group was so absorbed in their cruel entertainment that they didn't notice him until his shadow fell across their notebooks and laptops. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. The conversation stopped abruptly. 4 pairs of young eyes looked up at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to mild annoyance. The ringleader, a blonde girl in an expensive sweater, smiled with the practiced politeness of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. "Can we help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was an unwelcome interruption to their morning entertainment. The man's eyes moved deliberately around the table, making brief but meaningful contact with each student. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm. But there was steel beneath the surface. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about the young woman who works at the bookstore. The one you were describing with such creativity." The students exchanged glances. The blonde girl's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, we were just talking. Is there a problem?" "That depends," the man replied, pulling out an empty chair from a nearby table. He didn't ask permission before sitting down, creating an intimate circle that made escape impossible without obvious rudeness. "Do you think there might be a problem with spending your morning inventing cruel stories about someone you don't know?" Sarah watched from her corner table, her heart pounding. She could see the students beginning to realize this wasn't going to be a brief interruption. The easy confidence they had displayed moments earlier was starting to crack. A young man with carefully styled hair and a designer backpack leaned forward. "Look, sir, we weren't hurting anyone. It's just conversation." The older man took a slow sip of his coffee, never breaking eye contact. "Just conversation," he repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me something, son. Do you know what happened to the young woman you were discussing? Do you know how she got those scars you find so entertaining?" The students remained silent, their discomfort growing more visible by the second. "I'm going to guess you don't," the man continued. "But I'm going to tell you what I do know about scars like those, because I've seen plenty of them in my time." He set his coffee cup down with deliberate precision and slowly rolled up his right sleeve, revealing a network of old burn scars that covered most of his forearm. The student's eyes widened, their previous bravado evaporating. "These came from a roadside bomb outside Kabul in 2003, he said matter-of-factly. "I was lucky. My buddy Jimmy wasn't. He died trying to pull me out of that burning vehicle. But before he died, he saved 3 other soldiers who were trapped in there with us." The coffee shop had grown quieter around them, though the man's voice remained conversational. Sarah noticed that other patrons were now openly listening, their own activities temporarily forgotten. "Now," he continued, rolling his sleeve back down, "I could sit here and tell you about every person I've known who bears marks like mine. The firefighter who went back into a building one too many times. The mother who shielded her children in a car accident. The teenager who pulled his little sister out of a house fire." The blonde girl's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "But I think what strikes me most about your conversation," the man said, his tone growing colder, "is how certain you seemed that visible differences are something to be mocked. How confident you were that someone's scars make them less worthy of basic human dignity." One of the other students, a young woman who had been quieter during the earlier conversation, looked down at her hands. We weren't trying to be mean." "Weren't you?" the man asked. "Because from where I was sitting, it sounded like you were competing to see who could come up with the most creative ways to dehumanize another person. Someone who goes to your school, who works to pay for her education, who probably struggles every day with people's reactions to her appearance." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah could see tears beginning to form in one student's eyes. The man leaned forward slightly. Let me tell you something about the kind of person you were mocking. In my experience, people who bear visible scars often have the strongest character you'll ever encounter. They've faced something that would break most of us, and they've chosen to keep going. They get up every morning knowing they'll face stares and whispers and cruel comments like yours, and they do it anyway. He paused, letting his words sink in. That young woman you were making fun of? She shows more courage walking into a classroom than you've probably shown in your entire comfortable lives. The designer backpack student shifted uncomfortably. We didn't think about it that way. No, the man agreed. You didn't think at all. And that's the problem. Sarah found herself leaning forward, hanging on every word. This stranger was saying everything she had wished someone would say during her darkest moments, giving voice to feelings she had struggled to articulate even to herself. Here's what's going to happen, the man continued. You're going to think about this conversation every time you're tempted to turn someone else's pain into your entertainment. You're going to remember that behind every visible difference is a human story, usually one involving more strength and resilience than you can imagine. The blonde girl finally found her voice, though it was much smaller than before. You're right. We were being awful. Yes, you were, he confirmed without hesitation. The question now is what you're going to do about it. We could apologize to her, suggested the young woman who had been crying. The man shook his head. This isn't about one apology to one person. This is about how you treat people, period. It's about whether you're going to be the kind of adults who tear others down or build them up. He stood slowly, his artificial leg making the movement more deliberate than it might have been for others. Every person in this coffee shop has struggles you know nothing about. Every person you pass on the street is fighting battles you can't see. Your scars just happen to be invisible. The students sat in stunned silence as he picked up his coffee cup. I hope you'll remember that, he said simply, and began walking toward an empty table near the window. Sarah watched him go, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. In her corner of the coffee shop, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense that someone understood, that someone cared enough to speak up when it mattered. The students remained at their table, but the cruel laughter was gone. They spoke in hushed tones now, their earlier entertainment replaced by what looked like genuine reflection and discomfort. One of them pulled out her phone and began typing what Sarah hoped was a message to the bookstore employee they had been mocking. Emma, the barista, approached the man's new table with a fresh coffee. This one's on the house, Sarah heard her say quietly. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. The man nodded his thanks but waved away the free drink. Just doing what anyone should do, he replied. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have done what he did. Most people would have minded their own business, uncomfortable with confrontation, uncertain about their right to intervene in others' conversations. She looked down at her own long sleeves, then back at the man who had just changed the entire atmosphere of the coffee shop with nothing more than honesty and moral courage. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something stirring within her, not the familiar fear and shame, but something that felt surprisingly like hope. For several minutes after the confrontation, Sarah remained frozen in her corner seat, coffee growing cold in her hands. The coffee shop had returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The group of students continued to sit at their table, but their body language had completely changed. Where there had once been careless laughter, now there was quiet conversation and what appeared to be genuine soul-searching. Sarah watched as the blonde girl who had led the earlier mockery pulled out her phone and began typing with unusual concentration. The young woman who had started crying was now talking earnestly with her companions. Her voice too low to hear, but her expression serious and remorseful. The veteran had settled at his table by the window, reading a newspaper with his coffee. Occasionally, other customers approached him, not to intrude, but to offer quiet words of appreciation. Sarah overheard fragments. "Thank you for speaking up," and "that took real courage." Each time, the man responded with modest grace, deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the broader message rather than his own actions. This humility, combined with his earlier display of moral courage, painted a picture of someone whose character had been forged through genuine hardship and growth. Sarah found herself studying him more carefully now. The way he held his newspaper suggested familiarity with making the most of simple pleasures. His clothes were well-maintained but not expensive, speaking to someone who valued dignity over displays of wealth. Most telling were his eyes, kind but alert, carrying the weight of experience without bitterness. As she watched, one of the students from the group, the young woman who had shown the most remorse, approached his table. Sarah couldn't hear their entire conversation, but she caught enough to understand that the student was asking for advice on how to make meaningful amends, not just to the bookstore employee they had mocked, but for their pattern of behavior in general. The man listened carefully, occasionally nodding or asking quiet questions. When the student returned to her table, her expression suggested she had received wisdom that went beyond simple platitudes about being nicer to people. Sarah realized she had been holding her breath throughout this exchange. There was something profound happening here, a moment of genuine human connection across generational and experiential divides. The veteran wasn't lecturing or punishing, he was teaching, sharing hard-won understanding with people who desperately needed it. Unable to contain herself any longer, Sarah stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, not from physical weakness, but from the emotional weight of what she was about to do. She had spent 2 years avoiding meaningful interactions with strangers, especially in public spaces where her scars might draw attention or comment. But watching this man's quiet courage had awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long. The recognition that hiding from the world wasn't protecting her, it was diminishing her. She approached his table slowly, her heart racing with each step. When she reached him, she stood quietly until he looked up from his newspaper, offering her a gentle smile. "Excuse me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to thank you for what you did just now." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit down. And there's no need to thank me. I just said what needed saying." Sarah settled into the chair, acutely aware that this was the first time in months she had voluntarily engaged in conversation with a stranger. "It meant more than you know," she said, unconsciously tugging at her sleeves. The man's eyes, sharp with intelligence and experience, took in the gesture without judgment. "We all need to speak up more often," he said simply. "Silence in the face of cruelty becomes complicity pretty quickly." "I know," Sarah admitted. "I've been silent for a long time myself." They sat in comfortable quiet for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, the man extended his hand across the table. "I'm Frank Morrison." "Sarah Martinez," she replied, shaking his hand and noticing how the scars on his fingers told stories she could only imagine. "Sarah," Frank said thoughtfully, "can I share something with you? Something I learned the hard way?" She nodded, surprised by how naturally this conversation was flowing, despite her usual anxiety around new people. "When I came back from overseas, I spent a lot of time angry at the world," Frank began. "Angry at people who stared, angry at people who looked away, angry at people who thanked me for my service without understanding what that meant. I was angry at my body for being damaged, angry at my mind for being changed, angry at a life that suddenly seemed smaller than the one I had planned." Sarah felt tears welling up, recognizing her own experience in his words. "But somewhere along the way, I realized that my anger was really fear. Fear that I wasn't the person I used to be. Fear that other people would see me differently. Fear that my scars defined me more than my character. He took a sip of his coffee, giving his words time to settle. The thing is, our scars do tell part of our story. But they're not the whole story, and they're certainly not the ending. Every time we choose to engage with the world despite our fears, every time we show kindness despite having experienced cruelty, every time we stand up for someone else who's struggling, that's writing the rest of our story. Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. It's hard, though. People can be so cruel without even thinking about it. They can, Frank agreed. But people can also be surprisingly kind when given the chance. The trick is not letting the cruel ones convince you that everyone is like them. He glanced over at the students, who were now gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. Before they did, the blonde girl approached their table one more time. "I wanted you both to know," she said, addressing both Frank and Sarah. "We went to the bookstore and found the girl we were talking about. Her name is Maria, and we apologized. Really apologized, not just to make ourselves feel better." She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "She told us about the car accident that burned her arms and about how she's studying to become a nurse because she wants to help other trauma patients. She's incredible, and we were horrible." Frank nodded approvingly. "What matters now is how you move forward. We're starting a support group on campus," the girl continued, "for students dealing with visible differences, chronic illnesses, anything that makes them feel isolated. Maria is going to help us organize it." After the student left, Frank turned back to Sarah with a meaningful look. "See what I mean? People can surprise you." Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Maybe I should consider joining something like that." "Maybe you should consider leading something like that," Frank suggested. "You'd be surprised how much wisdom you've gained from your experiences, how much you could help others who are walking the same path." As they continued talking, Sarah discovered that Frank volunteered at a veterans hospital, mentoring other wounded soldiers through their recovery and reintegration. He also spoke at schools about bullying and the importance of empathy, using his own story to help young people understand the power of their words and actions. "The funny thing about trauma," Frank said, as their conversation began to wind down, "is that it can either make you bitter or it can make you compassionate. The choice is always ours." When Sarah finally stood to leave, she felt fundamentally different than she had when she'd arrived that morning. The long sleeves were still there, the scars still existed. But her relationship to both had begun to shift. She was no longer the woman hiding in the corner, afraid of judgment and cruelty. As she reached the door, Frank called out to her. "Sarah, I come here every Tuesday around this time. You're welcome to join me if you'd like to continue our conversation." She turned back with a genuine smile. "I'd like that very much." Walking out into the sunlight, Sarah felt the warmth on her face in a way she hadn't noticed in months. She passed a young man with a visible limb difference, and instead of averting her eyes out of discomfort or misplaced sympathy, she offered him a genuine nod of acknowledgement. One survivor to another. Her phone buzzed with another text from her sister. "How was your morning out?" This time, Sarah's response was different. Instead of a brief, non-committal reply, she typed, "Life-changing. I think I'm ready to stop hiding." As she walked home, Sarah began mentally composing a letter to the support group the students were forming. She had skills in graphic design from her pre-accident career, experience in recovery that could benefit others, and a new understanding of her own strength that Frank had helped her recognize. The scars were still there, would always be there, but now they felt less like badges of shame and more like evidence of survival, resilience, and the capacity for renewal. Frank had shown her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act with kindness and conviction despite that fear. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah had made several decisions. She would reach out to Maria at the bookstore. She would volunteer to help with the new support group. She would have lunch with her sister without wearing long sleeves, regardless of the weather. Most importantly, she would return to the coffee shop next Tuesday, not to hide in the corner, but to continue learning from a man who had shown her that the most powerful response to having been wounded was to dedicate yourself to healing others. In the end, it hadn't been a grand gesture or a dramatic moment that changed Sarah's life. It had been one person choosing to speak up when silence was easier, choosing kindness when indifference was simpler, choosing to see the humanity in others when cynicism was more comfortable. Sometimes, that's all it takes to remind someone that they are not alone, that their story matters, and that their scars, visible or invisible, are just one chapter in a story that's still being written.